Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to present this money talk this evening. Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. So I don't really need to say anything very much about myself. One thing I will say is that I do have loads of notes, because 25 minutes is a long time to speak. So if you see me kind of going like this or whatever, you know, I'm referring to my notes. One thing that you don't know, because this has just happened, is that as well as being one of the oldest credit unions in the country and, you know, one of the financially strongest credit union, we have recently been awarded the Fair Life Mark. And for those of you who don't know what Fair Life is, it's independently, we're independently accredited or measured, that mark then by the Fair Life charity, and the mark assures our members that our products and services exceed the standards required for financial services, and it also indicates that we're a fair trading finance provider, which means that our products are easier to understand and it helps our members to choose confidently. And, you know, this year we have one of the largest changes in finance that's happening, the consumer duty. And this is really important, really, really relevant for our adherence to and our compliance with the consumer duty. So, so this evening, I'm going to be discussing with you the economic profile of Black communities in the UK and the role of Black-led churches in addressing these matters. But in doing so, I'm also going to be focusing on the African Caribbean. I'm going to start at Windrush to talk about Windrush and money and build up to the situation today, focusing on the African Caribbean church communities. And of course, I will also talk about our own experiences at PCU, because actually we are an organisation, well, our founder is a Windrush, you know, came here during the period of Windrush, and actually his experiences inspired him to set up the Pentecostal Credit Union. So that's really important. So this year, as Sarah said, marks 75 years since HMT Empire Windrush docked at Tilbury in June 1948. And the Windrush generation, as they're known, refers to those people who arrived in the UK, mainly from the Caribbean, between 1948 and 1970. So why did they come? Well, they were economic migrants. They came here to work, principally, actually. And for many, it was their intention to stay for 5 years and then return. In fact, my mum, who came here in 1956, my mum says, everybody came for 5 years. Everyone said they were going home after 5 years. So they came to improve their lives in the Caribbean, actually. And they came from those Caribbean islands that were part of the then British Empire. And they had the right to come as citizens of the British Empire. That has since changed, but that's how it was. So the British West Indies, the British West Indies, as it was called, were colonized British territories in the Caribbean, which consisted of Anguilla, the Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos Islands, Montserrat, the British Virgin Islands, Antigua and Barbuda, the Bahamas, Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, British Guyana, now Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and also Bermuda, and the British Honduras, now Belize. Now, there was a reason why I actually listed all of them, so you can see how much of the Caribbean was part of, you know, which was part of the British West Indies or the colonies of the time. The Second World War had an enormous impact across the Caribbean. There was an increased pressure to produce additional food and materials for export to support the Allied forces while maintaining domestic consumption. Unemployment rose to record levels. So the economic impact in the islands was profound. It decimated the islands, actually. For context, the war left Britain, you might know, essentially bankrupt, with insolvency only averted in 1946 after the negotiation of a $4.3 billion loan from the United States, the last installment of which was repaid in 2006. So the islands were left economically moribund, and they had little choice but to come here to work. So there's been some discussion recently. I don't know if you've been following some of the debates around Windrush. In June, there were lots of things on social media, and people were talking a lot about Windrush and whether or not people were invited to come in 1948, and whether or not they really came to help to rebuild the mother country. So I thought it would be interesting, really, just to talk about what actually did happen in 1948 and why they really came. So it's true, they were not invited in 1948. There's been some things around, and well, they were invited to come in 1948, they weren't. Not in 1948, as I said, they came because the opportunities arose because they needed to come to work. However, between 1960 and 1963, there was a scheme to encourage nurses from the British West Indies, it was called, to come here to work in the fairly newly established NHS, National Health Service, which incidentally is also 75 years old this year. The health secretary at the time was a chap called Enoch Powell, who came to fame 5 years later with his infamous Rivers of Blood speech. And I'll just quote a line that's frequently quoted, where he said, "As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood." And he espoused this in his opposition to Caribbean immigration and the passage of the Race Relations Act in 1968. So they weren't invited. They didn't come because they were invited in 1948, but there was definitely an invitation for nurses to come in the early 60s. Did they come to rebuild the mother country? Well, I'm not actually sure they did. I've never heard anybody in my parents' generation ever said they came to rebuild the mother country, although that's something that's also said about why they came. You know, they did come to rebuild their homes in the Caribbean and their families. And they did that. Part of what they did was sending money home. They used to send money home every week. From the money they earned, money went back every week or every month to help to sustain their families. And many still do. My mother still sends money home, although her parents died many years ago, but she has sisters, and she has she has family in Jamaica, and she sends money home. Yeah, they still do that. For many, those 5 years turned into 25 years, and more still never returned. It's because life happens, doesn't it, really? People got married and had families and decided to stay and make their homes here. So what did we bring? Well, we bought lots of things, but for our purposes this evening, I just want to focus on two. Firstly, we bought our labour. Windrush migrants worked in generally lower paid jobs, unsocial hours. They worked long hours on no pay, often taking on 2 or more jobs to earn a living, in factories, labouring, transport and cleaning jobs, and of course in the NHS. So there's no doubt that they did their part to rebuild the nation after World War II. They often worked in jobs that they were well overqualified for. And this really was because of discrimination. Many who were professionals like teachers were not able to get employment in their professions because they were told their qualifications acquired overseas qualifications were not accepted here. So living conditions were low in standards, but high in rent. Many families were living cheek by jowl in 1 or 2 rooms, frequently having to double up to share beds, depending on shift patterns and having to cook on landings. Houses were badly insulated with no central heating and only blue or pink paraffin heaters. discrimination in housing was rife, as signs like no dogs, no blacks, no Irish were common. And the slum landlord, Peter Rackman, made a mint out of providing slum housing to Caribbean migrants who could not get housing elsewhere. However, and there's a big but, many Caribbean households managed to get mortgages and buy their homes during this time, despite the discrimination that they encountered. Financial exclusion and blatant discrimination was normal everyday occurrence in migrant communities, and there was no law to stop discrimination in the provision of what they called goods and facilities and services until 1968. It was a 1968 Race Relations Act that Enoch Powell was so opposed to that actually outlawed for the first time discrimination in education, in housing, and in employment. So how did they get that deposit for those mortgages, which, because of discrimination, was frequently more than white households had to pay, with higher interest rates? And this brings us neatly to the second matter that I want to focus on, and what the second thing that we brought here, which is community banking and the concept of credit unions. So community banking finds its roots actually in the African tradition of Isusu. It is ancient. Isusu describes traditional forms of cooperation in African societies whereby groups of individuals contribute to informal savings and credit associations for their mutual benefit, people helping people. According to the academic Edward S. Maynard, writing in 1996, Isusu practices migrated to the Caribbean at the time of the transatlantic slave trade. In Jamaica, the practice is called partner, while in other Caribbean islands, it is known as syndicate, boxhand, or susu. These community banking systems operate outside of the formal legal and financial systems and function solely on allegiance, mutual trust, and the integrity of the participants. And this is really, really important to understand, that actually there are very, very few times that there's any kind of robbery or people steal people's money in these community banking systems. It just doesn't happen like that. There is such a big there's such a big spirit, a large spirit of trust and honesty, that it very rarely happens. So Windrush migrants brought the practices of Isusu to the UK, and it flourished here as a result of the financial exclusion that they were experiencing with discriminatory practices of the banks and other financial systems. And what's really interesting about this, and we're going to talk about something else that flourished because of discrimination, when communities are excluded, they find their own ways within their communities to deliver their services to themselves. That happens commonly across communities. And this is what happened with Partner, and this has also happened with our Black churches. So Partner and Susu assisted many people of the Windrush era with making major purchases, such as funding the deposits for those mortgages and paying the travel and other costs of family members joining them here. But as I said, Isusu was not the only community banking system that Caribbean Windrush migrants bought here. The first recorded British credit union was the Hornsey Cooperative. This was established in 1964 in North London by Caribbean families and is the foundation of what is now London Capital Credit Union. The Hornsey Cooperative served its community for over 49 years, one of the longest serving credit unions ever. Basil Lewis, who's this chap here, he was a founder and became the first Black mayor of Haringey in 1968. A Hornsey Cooperative merged with London Capital in 2013, and along with other Caribbean credit unions, it founded the Credit Union League of Great Britain, which is the forerunner of the Association of British Credit Unions, ABCUL, we call it today, which is a credit union trade body. So the significant contribution of Windrush migrants to the development of the British credit union sector is generally unknown, because it's never told. And actually what we do at PCU is every Black History Month, and this time for Windrush, we tell the story over and over. We've got a video and we put it out there so that people know actually that it was a significant contribution that these communities, these Windrush migrants made. So credit unions then and today are one of the most popular forms of banking in the Caribbean. According to the World Council of Credit Unions, the countries with the highest percentage of credit union members in the economically active population were, first of all, Barbados with 82%, the highest, Ireland with 75%, Grenada 72%, Trinidad and Tobago 68%, Belize and St. Lucia 67% each, St. Kitts and Nevis 58%, Jamaica 53%, Antigua and Barbuda 49%. So you can see here that the Caribbean representation across the world in relation to credit union membership is overwhelming. So Windrush migrants brought the concept of community banking to the UK in the two forms of credit unions and Isusu traditions. But at the same time that Partner was flourishing, so was the growth of the Black majority Pentecostal church. So we're just going to move here now just to talk about our story, because this is very relevant to this and linking it. So this is our founder. And he doesn't look like that today. This was 1955 when he came here. So we always tell this story, and we use it basically to introduce ourselves often. So in 1955, a 17-year-old boy arrived here from Jamaica. One Sunday, he attended his local Anglican church service because he was an Anglican in Jamaica. He wasn't Pentecostal, he was an Anglican. At the end of the service, the vicar thanked him for coming, but asked him not to return. 30 years later, he was returning to Anglican churches to buy their buildings. So that boy was Carmel Jones, and this is the backstory of the Pentecostal Credit Union, because that experience of discrimination actually is the thing that influenced him and inspired him years later to found PCU. So 25 years later, PC was born in 1980 from a tiny room in his house in Balham, where 16 people met with £1.20 investment, grew one of the strongest credit unions in the UK today. Carmel Jones, if he was here today, he would describe to you a vision that fueled his passion and energy for developing the credit union in those early days. He harnessed and built upon the belief that the route to inclusion for Black communities was an economic one, and strove to fill the vacuum in our economic lives that had been created by the mainstream financial institutions of the day. So PCU was seen as a vehicle for both social and financial inclusion. Hard work and dedication underpinned the PCU's rapid growth as the news spread throughout Pentecostal churches in London. By 2010, PCU was providing services to Pentecostal churches and their congregants throughout the whole of the UK. So Reverend Jones's deep insight in marrying the Black majority Pentecostal church with the concept of credit unions has provided a powerful and positive influence for Black communities in the UK. This marriage easily reflected mutual principles of fairness, helping one's neighbour, justice, and working together to make the world a better place in which to live. So that experience of discrimination that Reverend Jones encountered was not unusual. Many people experience discrimination from Anglican churches and other denominations in just the same way. When we tell that story, loads of people had the same experience when they arrived here. However, some people did not continue to worship. For some people, it turned them off worshiping. It didn't do that for him. He joined a small group, the Calvary Church of God in Christ, that were meeting in small groups of people. They met in their living rooms. So actually, when this happened to him in that church, he had some friends who said to him, "Come along to a church group. You know, they were meeting in their living rooms, they were meeting like that, and that's what they were doing. And he went and he joined a church group. These groups graduated from living rooms to renting church halls. They were there, they were in their living rooms, 1950s, early 60s, mid 60s, they were renting church halls from those Anglican churches and others, you know, who had full church halls to rent. We were renting those church halls. I remember that when I was a child. And the Calvary Church of God in Christ that Reverend Jones was a member of, they were meeting in a hall in Sussex Road in Brixton. Sussex Road doesn't exist anymore, actually. They've paved it all over. I think they've got a massive estate there now, but that's what it was. So Pentecostal ministries based in church halls flourished, and by the late 1970s had outgrown their church halls and amassed enough money to purchase church buildings. At the same time, the UK Anglican Church was experiencing severe decline in their congregations and was selling their buildings. It appeared to be a match made in heaven. However, when Pentecostal leaders approached their banks of financing to purchase these buildings, they were turned away. Cue the emergence of the Pentecostal Credit Union, according to Reverend Jones, another heaven-sent solution. But with visionary insight, he connected the vehicle of community banking provided by the credit union model with the need to finance the purchase of church buildings for Pentecostal ministries, as well as regularizing the Isusu tradition of partner for the personal financial needs of Pentecostal Christians. So given that legacy of trailblazing, and pioneering optimism that fueled our settlement in the UK, where are we today? Well, there's good news and there's bad news. So the good news is the Black majority church movement in the UK is thriving and growing exponentially. That growth includes the development of the African churches who were established here post Windrush, actually. However, from those early Windrush church groups, we have some of the oldest and largest Black-led church, Pentecostal church denominations: Church of God in Christ, COGIC, New Testament Church of God, New Testament Assembly, Church of God of Prophecy. They're the largest ones, and they're just to name a few. And of course, these church organizations are actually celebrating over the past couple of years. And so last year, I think COGIC celebrated their 70th. This year, New Testament Church of God is celebrating their 70th anniversary of establishment in the UK. And of course, many newer church groups have sprang from these parents. So the legacy of that trailblazing and entrepreneurial spirit can be seen in the current day development of Black-led churches in the UK. And of course, there have been many other successes. But this next point, however, probably won't be news to you. You know, I'm going to sort of go through some data. But actually, we are also one of the most economically disadvantaged, or I should say disenfranchised, of all communities in the UK today. And there is substantial evidence, international as well as national, that racial discrimination is a major driver of those economic disparities. Evidence from the UK illustrates that these disparities manifest themselves in terms of minorities living in poorer quality accommodation, housing, having lower quality teachers, and worse health outcomes. We're also disadvantaged in the UK labour market despite equal opportunity legislation aimed at mitigating those disadvantages. Unemployment rates for Black people have been around double that of white people for over 50 years. According to the Equality and Human Rights Commission, this gap appears to have widened since the global financial crisis of 2007/8, and an ethnic pay gap also exists, driven mainly by occupational, I've just lost my bit, by occupational segregation that relates to minorities working in lower paid occupations compared with whites. So I've just got some data here that I want to share with you. But currently today, we are experiencing the worst economic crisis for over 40 years. And as the UK economy contracts, pre-existing disparities in the labour market are exacerbated. So this data has been produced by government agencies and academic institutions over the last 50 years. And it paints a picture, a consistent picture of the economic status of Black communities in this country. Black people persistently feature highly amongst all the indices of poverty and deprivation. So we have, firstly, Black households are amongst the most likely to be poor and most likely to be living in persistent poverty. Black people are amongst those more likely to be living in areas of deprivation. Black adults of working age are more likely to be unemployed as compared to white British adults. Home ownership is substantially lower amongst Black African households in particular. African, Caribbean, other Black households are amongst those most likely to be living in social housing. Black people are amongst those most likely to be living in low-income households. Black people are more likely to be single-parent households, limiting the number of potential earners. And Black people are least likely of all ethnic groups to be small employers or business owners. And because of their worse outcomes in the labour market, Black people have fewer savings. According to the Runnymede Trust, for every £1 of white British wealth, the figure for Black Caribbean is 20p, and for Black Africans is 10p. So that's just about the grimmest. I mean, you can just, switch off. It's just the grimmest stuff. But the data is clear. Black people in the UK are amongst those more likely to be financially excluded. And of course, for those affected by financial exclusion, there is a poverty premium to be paid, owing to the limited choices that they have when it comes to available forms of affordable credit. Many financially excluded people are forced to take out high-cost loans because of their lack of other options. They're also faced with increased costs from other sources, such as utility bills that often offer discounts when purchased online or paid monthly via direct debit. As financial difficulties often lead to stress, it comes as no surprise then that health and well-being are also affected. Access to financial services is essential for citizens to be economically and socially integrated into today's society. It is a requirement for employment, economic growth, poverty reduction, and social inclusion. And I'm going to say that again, because this is so key, really. Access to financial services is essential for citizens to be economically and socially integrated in today's society. It is also a requirement for employment, economic growth, poverty reduction, and social inclusion. So you will understand then that when I say that the route to equality and true inclusion is an economic one, wealth creation is absolutely key for our communities. And I want to be absolutely clear about this. This message is not about prosperity, promoting prosperity gospel, because that's not what we do at PCU. But it is about building the financial and economic strengths of our communities, and our communities that are lagging behind others in this regard to their detriment. The reasons for our financial exclusion are multifaceted, but of course we've discussed discrimination and racial exclusion sit at that seat of all of them. But as much as we might ponder and wring our hands in despair at the data, there is another story about the economic power and capacity of our communities, and one that does not have the same prominence as the deficit nature of the indices that I've just quoted to you, and most frequently quoted to all of us about Black communities in the UK. There is a rapidly growing spirit of wealth creation and entrepreneurship in our communities, especially in our churches. It's always been there, actually, but in most recent years, it has achieved greater recognition and, as I said, is growing rapidly. So in relation to all that information, let's look at the role of the Black majority church. Right, just lost my place. Right, so most economic studies of Black communities tend to ignore the contributions of the churches to Black economic mobility. The Black majority church in the UK is central to the economic development of the Black community for a number of reasons. It is nationally and internationally organised. It is the most independent of Black institutions, being supported mainly by the Black community itself. It is the largest socio-economic institution in the Black community. It is the largest repository of Black monetary wealth. Anecdotally, entrepreneurship and business ownership is higher in the Black majority church than within the Black community more generally. Black majority churches are reputable, time-honoured institutions within the African and Caribbean communities in the UK. They are stable, they are valued, and long-established structures of social order, laying down customs and governing behaviour, and their phenomenal growth over recent years indicates that their power and potential to influence and create change is increasing. Today, it is the strongest institution in the Black community. So the Black church can make a significant impact upon the economic viability of the Black community in the UK if it uses its resources in a collective, intentional, and strategic manner. Financial empowerment of Black communities is key. This means having the financial freedom, the choice, and the confidence to access whatever financial services are available and suitable for individual or collective needs. If the Black majority church is to facilitate the economic empowerment of Black communities, it will have to redirect its financial and other resources into 4 key areas. And these areas are, first of all, financial exclusion or inclusion. And that is addressing the financial literacy and capability of our communities, which will lead to deeper understanding of financial products and services, improved financial management and choice, and debt reduction, wealth creation and asset building, understanding the importance of and increased commitment to saving, investing, and acquiring possessions of value, which help to build resilience against financial shocks, invest in the future, and build confidence and hope. Entrepreneurship, church leaders should raise the spirit of entrepreneurship in the church by utilising a range of measures to educate, nurture, support, and encourage business ownership. And supporting and encouraging Black enterprise and initiatives. Building a wealth of a community means ensuring that the resources of that community circulates and builds a momentum for as long as possible within that community. And this can be done through continued support for organisations such as us, the Pentecostal Credit Union, and other credit unions, because, you know, the credit union model actually is a wealth creating model for the people in the credit union community, because it ensures that money circulates in that community. So that's a time-honoured way of building the financial competence and capacity of communities. And that's why credit unions and community banks are really so important in communities. And I'm going to be saying something a bit more about that in a minute. So I'm coming to an end, but I just want to say this finally, and this is about our government, because this is not only about our churches. I've been saying, well, churches can do this, churches can do that, but, and they can and they should, but they did not set up the system that excludes us, so they can't dismantle it. Only the people who are responsible for this can do this. So the key player here is the UK government, whatever political persuasion they happen to be. And they need to do a few things as far as we're concerned. They need to recognise and acknowledge the significant and burgeoning level of entrepreneurship in Black majority churches. Along with this is a significant influence of that these organisations have within their local communities. We would ask the government to look to develop programs to engage with Black majority churches to encourage and support their efforts to further increase and develop business ownership in their churches and in their local communities. Create an economic development strategy for the Black community in the UK. Evidence of the economic disenfranchisement of Black communities is overwhelming, with evidence that fiscal policies in particular have impacted negatively on Black communities. No government has ever comprehensively addressed this. And we'd ask that the government look seriously, to begin to look seriously at initiating an economic development infrastructure for Black communities in the UK, which recognises and includes the role of our churches as key institutions in our communities. And the final thing actually relates to community banks like ours, really, and that is to look to review the current 10% limitation on credit unions with respect to corporate lending. And this will enable credit unions to support the entrepreneurial needs and ambitions of its business owning membership. Community entrepreneurship should be encouraged, and there's no better understanding and support for this than can be found in a community bank. Along with this, government should seek to provide funding to credit unions to establish business member development programs aimed at enabling members with entrepreneurial ambitions to achieve their goals and establish their businesses. So I close with this final message. Entrepreneurship and business ownership is the route to our economic advancement, and the Black Church is key to where it's happening. It has a critical role to drive its growth by recognising and pushing the spirit of enterprise that in itself is the bedrock of the success behind the growth of the Black-led church in the UK.